I'm Marjorie Krause. I'm the founder and executive chairman of APCO Worldwide, and we're happy to be your host today, along with Jen M. And we will be talking a little more about that in just a minute. I just want to go over some housekeeping announcements before we start our session today. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with the formats of these kind of Zoom calls. There won't be a raise your hand function on today's call, so you've been automatically muted. But we want to take your questions as we go in English or Spanish. And if they're in Spanish, my colleague Judith Arenas will you'll hear a voice translating for us. And then if you put them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen in the chat box, we'll be able to pull them up as we go. And so please be sure to do that because we would like very much to hear from you. We also will be recording this session, and when you're finished, when we're finished, we'll post it at our website at apcoworldwide.com, and we have a special section on the coronavirus that has this webinar and some others that we have done. So you can feel free to go there or share it as you wish. And we will have some detailed information in here that comes from other kinds of polling we've done. So don't feel compelled to take a lot of notes because you can come back and pick up the webinar with all of the details afterward. So let me just introduce our panelists. We have a very distinguished group of people. And then I'm going to turn this over to my co-host to say a few words. So Frederico is our co-host, and he's a strategist and founder for Gen M. And you'll hear from him in a minute. Jim McGregor is the chairman of Greater China for APCO Worldwide. Jim is a very well-known person following China. He's written several award-winning books. He's been in the market for over 30 years. And he went there with Dow Jones, and he's the former bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal. And Jim has been very deeply involved in this whole pandemic from the very beginning in China. So he'll give us a perspective from there, which should be very interesting in setting the stage for the rest of the world. Georges Zhou is the former president of the European Investment Fund and former head of the international group at the New York Stock Exchange, as well as a very distinguished person in the financial community through his own advisory firm, Galileo Partners, and is a member of our advisory board. And he'll give us an idea of the financial implications of not only the virus, but the aftermath of the virus. Because I think you'll hear from all of us that there's not an end to this right now. There's just the end of the beginning, and we don't quite know where the end is. And we'll talk a little more about that. And then Ambassador Tony Wayne is former ambassador to Mexico and Argentina. And Ambassador Wayne, for those of you from Mexico, is no stranger, and he's been involved in things relating to Latin America for a very long time and has had a long and distinguished career in the foreign service around the world for the US government. We're delighted to have you, Ambassador Wayne. And Javier Colombo is a senior vice president at Everbridge. And Everbridge is a very interesting company that has found technological solutions to trying to help people not only predict kind of future outbreaks or future crises, but help people get back to work. And he's going to help us understand what kind of technology is available and how technology can be used not only to help predict things in the future, but to help us sort out some very practical aspects of how we move forward and we're able to get back to whatever the new normal is. So with that, Frederico, why don't I turn this over to you to say a few words?
Thank you so much, Marjorie. Buenos días a todos. APCO Worldwide es posiblemente la agencia de relaciones públicas y de comunicación más sólida que tenemos hoy en el mundo. Tiene 35 años de experiencia en más de 30 países y tiene una articulación de 800 mentes brillantes alrededor del mundo. Por eso, APCO Worldwide es el mejor aliado que GNM ha encontrado. Como todos ustedes saben, GNM inició hace 6 años con un solo objetivo: impulsar la evolución de la idiosincrasia de los mexicanos. GNM es una organización de la sociedad civil en donde articulamos a líderes políticos, empresariales y sociales de todo México y seguimos 5 principios esenciales para nosotros. Número 1, ser puntual. Número 2, no poner pretextos. Número 3, cumplir tus compromisos. Número 4, actuar con rectitud. Y número 5, nunca un mexicano en contra de otro mexicano. Por eso, en esta alianza que estamos haciendo en APCO Worldwide junto con GNM, que ya es una red de más de 10,000 jóvenes en todo México, lo que estamos buscando justamente es articular a estos líderes, pero sobre todo, y más importante, es brindar herramientas a los líderes que tienen que tomar decisiones el día de hoy, en esta crisis. Si posiblemente cuestiones hoy los empresarios, los políticos o algunos líderes no se ponen de acuerdo en el país, los jóvenes tenemos que tomar la batuta, ponernos de acuerdo, articularnos, pero con herramientas, con información y con estrategia. Por eso, esta es la primera sesión que vamos a hacer de una serie de webinars de Virtual Breakfast cada semana para traerles expertos en el mundo, expertos en México, para que nos hablen sobre cómo podemos justamente sobrepasar esta crisis de la mejor manera, con información, de una manera seria, de una manera responsable. Y bueno, pues los invito justamente a que utilicemos estos momentos para hacer una reflexión. Estaba ayer un buen amigo, me dijo que justamente Isaac Newton, dentro de la plaga que le tocó vivir cuando cierran la Universidad de Cambridge, esos meses que él pasó justamente encerrado fueron los que le dieron justamente todas estas ideas en cuanto a sus grandes estudios. Entonces creo que es un buen momento para poder empezar a tejer la red, para poder empezar a generar estas ideas y poderlas aplicar una vez la crisis termine o en algunos casos inmediatamente. Thank you, Marjorie, so much for believing in us, for believing in Mexico. We know that you have a space in your heart for Mexico. Thank you, Ambassador, for being the fan #1 of Mexico, and for GNM, that you, since the first day you arrived to Mexico, you understand what we are trying to do as organization here. Thank you for all the panelists, and thank you, Judith, for being the supporter #1 of what we're doing. Thank you.
I'm going to have to argue about the ambassador being the #1 fan of Mexico. So, you know, we're here for a pretty serious topic, because I think everybody will agree that the world is changing right before our eyes. And COVID-19, this pandemic, is unprecedented. And we lack the context, I think, to totally understand what the impact is and will be. We just know that things are changing a lot, and that we're dealing with a systemic risk that will have deep and maybe unforeseen consequences. So what we're trying to do today is to look at what will this new normal be that everybody's talking about, and especially to think about how is this going to impact Latin America, and what should we be thinking about for recovery and revival, and what are some of the things that can be done now in preparing and anticipating the future. This webinar is going to be the first in a series looking at this, and today we want to deal with the broader context. Where did this come from? How are we dealing with it? What can we expect, and where are we right now? And so we have a group of people that I've just introduced that will unpack this a little bit for everybody. So let me just tell you a little bit about kind of what our APCO and what my perspective is coming to this today, and what we've been doing. To give you a context, you know, you've already heard that we're a good friend of Mexico and Latin America, but we've also had a lot of experience dealing with these kind of situations, supporting governments and organizations with various crises, including pandemics. And also, because we're in China, we've been dealing with COVID-19 as an employer as well. And and watched as our own employees not only were impacted and we had our first closures, but also as people are coming back to work. And I think it's always instructive to look ahead and see what we can learn from that. Our legacy on pandemics goes back in part to H1N1. And in 2009, when the outbreak occurred of the swine flu in Mexico, we were able to send a team of people down to Mexico immediately, I think the second day. And we deployed a team of our own top health and crisis communicators to the president's office so that they would have the best team to help communicate the information that needed to go to the public, but also to understand within the government the best way to deal with this. And some of the people who were on this team actually were involved in some pre-planning that went on between the US government and the Mexican government way ahead of this crisis. There was a lot of discussion about what would happen so that people were a lot more prepared, even than they are today. And then as we came out of this, we conducted a lot of opinion research to figure out how you can really build the case for a sense of confidence in people, especially since Federico said that he's so involved in the tourism industry. You know, that's the lifeblood of the Mexican economy. And so we tried to work with Mexico to create a case to increase the positive news. And we were able to put together a program which created a strategy for Mexico with a new kind of campaign, getting people to look afresh and put all this behind them. And so that's, you know, it's not exactly analogous because I think this is broader and deeper and more felt around the world, but there are things that can be done. And I think if we're going to be solutions oriented, we need to look to the past to see what's relevant for the future. I also wanted to, before I open this up to everybody, which I'm going to do in just a minute, I wanted to share just a couple of slides with you about some research we've been doing around the world for previous of these webinars. So I'm going to take you on a quick tour of the world through 4 slides. And the first one, these are the results of looking back in the US, the US population, and this might be instructive for you, is that when we did a survey of the US population, this is all recent, within the last few weeks, 7 in 10 are concerned about what happens with social distancing after social distancing is lifted. That's 69% of the population. And so, Jim, you might comment on what we're doing in China about that. More than half are concerned about losing their jobs, which is a very real thing that people wake up with every day. 58% are worried about the effects on children's education. Our schools are closed, and people are dealing with homeschooling in various different ways. And then, you know, I think people expect 3 or 4 months for things to get back to normal. And that means the end of August. But I think there are a lot of people who think that there won't be a normal, and it'll be a whole new way that we have to work together, and we have to live together, and we have to deal with that. And so, you know, stock market performance and employment levels are seen as likely not to return to normal for at least a year. And George will address the financial implications. And then you can read on. There's more. And then the second slide was about shopping and on-site work, which were the 2 areas that were thought to be coming back the quickest. But you'll have these slides for after, but you can see that in relative degrees, schooling and colleges and universities are probably seen as the last area to come back to normal, with business travel not so far behind that. So that says a lot about how we will work and do business. And I know I have a granddaughter about to go to college, and she's very worried about the fact that she doesn't know if there'll be a fall semester. So I think this is affecting people in various different ways. If you're in the tourism business, the idea that leisure travel is down at the bottom of this list should get people really thinking about, what are some of the alternatives to this? How do we reinstate some of the ways, some of these industries that have been dependent on certain of these things? So I thought this was an interesting kind of snapshot, at least from the US, and we can repeat this in Latin America and see how much is the same, how much is different. We did a session like this in Saudi Arabia, and it was quite interesting that the Saudi economies, the Saudi citizens were much more optimistic about a bounce back. And so I think where you sit and how quickly you responded to what was around you has a lot to do with people's attitudes for the future. And so by contrast, I thought this was an interesting snapshot to look at. And then finally, I think this is kind of interesting. I think that from the US side anyway, I think the US population has really, and this has a lot to do, I think, with the future in foreign policy and maybe soft power even, but the US has held in highest esteem the countries they feel have gotten it right, the countries that have taken action that have reduced the potential for death and other impacts on their countries. And Jim, you'll note that in China, where maybe at first people had a lot more respect, the more that comes out about the timing and the information, the more that this has declined. And maybe that's a result of a lot of our media coverage, but you might comment on that as well. But you'll see that, certainly South Korea, Canada, and Germany are high on this list. And so I hope that gives you kind of a sense of maybe just a snapshot at the rest of the world. And with that, I'd like to just spend the rest of the time hearing from our panelists. So Jim, why don't you start by delivering some of your thoughts about the pandemic and the China perspective and what you've seen.
Sure, thank you, Marjorie. Well, on the practical side, China has proven that lockdowns and social distancing work. I mean, they were able to turn this around by very, very strong methods of people were in their apartment buildings. They were not allowed to leave except maybe one family member every few days, very strong temperature checks. And of course, China's able to do this because they have the Communist Party and they got the neighborhood committees that keep an eye on everybody anyhow, and they've also got a lot of technology behind it. What they're showing now is a sequential return to work is also effective. That you go back to, this is, for white collar at least, you go back to the offices, you put part of your team in, you have them at social distancing, you have them wearing masks in the office, at first at least. And now Shanghai is almost back to normal. People are going to restaurants, the offices are full. The factories have geared up again. The problem is, at first it was the problem of supply chains. Those are being restored. Now the problem is demand, especially for the exports, because they're up and running, but where are the buyers? With the rest of the world closed down. But China's looking at that as also as an opportunity because they're a couple months ahead of everybody. At the same time, they got to dig themselves out of a hole, economically, politically, and in terms of a global image, because this virus did come from China. It got out of China because it was being covered up, and there was a lot of, when you have such a top-down system as China, nobody at the lower levels is going to do anything till they get approval from the top, and the top didn't want it out for a while, and it became a big mess. China's trying to clean that up through diplomacy of masks and doctors and medicines, but even that has backfired in some ways because they've taken a very heavy hand with it, very strong rhetoric and kind of self-serving way of doing it. So that's not working very well. Meanwhile, the US and China, of course, as you can read in the headlines, it's more confrontational than any time since the Cold War, as the US tries to dig itself out of a hole of handling it terribly at first. And so let's put all the blame on China. And I'm afraid throughout the election, we're going to see that. But China's also very practical. Don't waste a crisis. They sense an opportunity. They've got a 2-month lead. And they are doubling down on what will bring their economy into long-term growth again. They are talking about a lot of more economic reforms, opening up much more economically. And they've been talking about that for a long time, but I think it's actually going to, a lot of it's going to be implemented this time because they need it in order to move ahead. They're also doubling down on their previous technology initiative, Made in China 2025. To goose investment in AI, robotics, cloud computing, all of the technologies of the future. Just as one example, Shanghai, which is always one of the most ambitious places on earth, they a couple weeks ago announced 150 projects worth $63 billion, 26 new special industrial zones. Some of this is packaged from before, but everybody's trying to outdo each other and powering ahead. We haven't seen a huge stimulus plan yet. I'm not sure we're going to, but if we do, it won't be till the National People's Congress, which was supposed to be May 5th. That may happen, I'm sorry, it's supposed to be March 5th. It may happen at the end of May. Q1, they're down 7%, which is, the first time China hasn't had that in 30 years. But the IMF is saying China might have 9% growth in 2021, but I think they're being very optimistic. Here's a big barrier. China can put money into state-owned enterprise. They can move that ahead. They're pretty good at dealing with downturns in demand for exports, but this is a consumer-led economy now. It's also a private enterprise economy. 80% of IRMA jobs come from private enterprise. Private enterprise is hurting. There's 80 million private enterprises in China. They're cash poor. They've been closed down during this time. Consumers, they need the consumers. Consumers are going to be sitting on their money. They're very worried about their job, whether their real estate's going to go down. So getting consumers to spend and getting cash to private enterprise to keep them going. The government tells banks, we want you lending to private enterprise, but at the end of the day, they don't do much of it because it's not a good credit reporting system and nobody wants to be caught making a bad loan. On foreign business, people are ring fencing their supply chains. They're increasing their supply chains in China for China. But when it comes to in China for the globe, a lot of that is moving out. They're looking at the vulnerabilities of having too many eggs in the China basket. For many years, people have been putting almost all their manufacturing in China, especially in the technology companies. But they're not going to be leaving because China's a market they need. But you're going to see a realignment of supply chains around the world, and that's going to be complicated, expensive, and it's going to take time. Just one final note. I was talking to a friend that runs a very large global consumer business in China with more than 3,000 stores, and they said that the way you're going to get growth out of China is you got to steal business from your competitors. So companies that have cash are going to be able to hold out and cut prices and power through. So I think we're going to see a dog-eat-dog market in China. With Marjorie.
So Jim, I just had one question before we go on to George. On the supply chain question, do you think that's an opportunity for Latin America in terms of coming up with things that they can do that are closer to the US market? For instance, if the supply chain is going to move around, is there an opportunity there?
Absolutely, absolutely. I remember about a year ago, I was meeting with the Chinese chairman of a big electronics firm. And in those days, I was talking about the tariffs. And I said, you're going to be hit by the American tariffs. Will you move some manufacturing to America? He said, no, America doesn't have the project managers, doesn't have the supply chain. I'll just expand in Mexico. A lot of these people are already in Mexico. It's close to the United States, the North American market, and elsewhere in Latin America. So I think it should be an opportunity. Absolutely. You got the labor. Actually, wages in China are no higher than in Mexico for factory workers because of all the social benefits on top of it. So yes, I do, Marjorie.
Thank you. George, tell us.
Yes, thank you very much, Marjorie. I'm going to try to make it as simple as I can in 5 minutes, and I'm going to take 5 observations that frame, I believe, the situation we are in. The first one is that you have to see the current situation as a theater play in 5 acts. And we are in act number 3. The first one, which nobody wants to recognize, is that since 2018, the economy has been in slowdown. It hasn't been a depression, but we went from 3.5% in the US to what's going to be 2% last year. Act number 2, the coronavirus. The coronavirus is an accelerator of the weakness and a destructor of not only health, but also the economy itself. But that one will be reasonably, if I can say so, limited to 2020. The third act is the act we are in today. And it is very clear what came out from the IMF meetings. We are in a deep recession for the whole year. And where I agree with Jim, the forecast of a rebound next year from the IMF are just political. And I know how we came to that conclusion, and you can imagine as much as I do where it came from. The second point, the fourth act is what comes after this recession. Are we going to effectively go into a depression? The answer to that depends on the depth and the length of the crisis, and it will not be the same in all parts of the world. And then the fifth one, which I don't expect before 2023, will be the beginning of a real recovery. So if you take that as a background, the second element that you need to understand is why the markets react, why they do, and the importance of the coronavirus. And I am pretty critical about the reporting of the coronavirus crisis that has been done by the media and by a lot of economists and other people, because the coronavirus by itself is a dramatic event, but it is not by itself an economic disaster. We made it an economic disaster by taking measures on which we will have all kinds of opinions when things move on. But the reality is that the coronavirus has been happening at a time where the economy was already weak. And therefore, the acceleration of the coronavirus has happened, but the coronavirus will not be driving what comes next. What we don't know is in which stage of the economy we will be when we will have life going back to more or less normal, which is probably this summer or this fall. The third element that I would like to say is that besides that economic weakness, I have been talking for years about the problem that our growth of the last few years has been completely funneled and organized by debt. It was not economic growth. In 2019, the stock market went up 25% and the earnings of the companies were flat. It is just a belief that if you continue to push debt, it will work. We have arrived at the end of that. Just to give you a number, last year, US companies bought back $1 trillion of their shares and distributed $500 billion in dividend. The money goes back to the shareholders. But the problem is that the companies are now at a level of indebtedness where the government has to step in. And that's why I advocate that dividends should only be paid in stock and not in cash. But we are in a very fragile situation, and we are entering something that will be very important when I talk about Latin America, which is, what does that mean for the sovereign crisis? Because the fourth element that we've seen, and the numbers have been given by the IMF last week, we have transferred $8 trillion of risk on the shoulders of the public sector. And transferring that on the shoulder of the public sector would be acceptable if the public sector was in good shape. But every single part of the world was over indebted way before the coronavirus was happening. We have added 40 trillion out of 23. We tripled the sovereign debt in the last 10 years. It is unbearable. We know it. And even if interest rates are lower, we know that the credit risk is there and it's no longer a liquidity crisis. And that explains why the spread between high yield and the government debt is now close to 1,000%. And that's why I'm so worried to see the central banks, both in Europe and in the United States, going into the high yield market. Now let me turn in the last minute on the Latin American situation. We entered this crisis with already 2 countries in default. And they are not small, Argentina and Venezuela. Argentina is experiencing its 7th financial crisis in 20 years. It's a governance issue, it's a management issue. But what are the strengths of the Latin America? There are 2 main elements that I believe can drive the future. But the first one is that Latin America is very dependent on raw materials. Now, let me talk about oil. What does it mean for Mexico, Brazil, and other countries? Pemex is a junk bond, Petróleos Mexicanos. So we have seen already the oil sector being in difficulty and overdebted before the crisis, but with what we have seen in the last 2 to 3 days in the evolution of the price of oil, back to what Marjorie was saying about the optimism of the Saudis, is obviously catastrophic. And it does mean also that there is a second drive here, which has been raw materials. For raw materials, you need to have economic growth. You need to have a buoyant car industry. Otherwise, the steel industry doesn't work. Latin America is very dependent on that. And the third one has already been mentioned, is tourism. So I believe that contrary to what everybody has been saying, Europe is this or this is happening, I believe that we should pay a lot of attention to Latin America, because the combination of the defaults, the oil, the raw materials, the tourism, and the situation before we entered into the crisis leads us to a difficulty. And it's going to be probably much deeper and much longer in Latin America. And because I know a little bit about Latin America, it means social unrest. While I'm not sure that we will all be on the streets in the United States against our governments, I am pretty sure that it will happen in Latin America. And that leads to the political issue that we have in a number of cases. Last word, because everybody is asking me the question, I might as well give you what my answer is. The market is neurotic. I've known that. I was at the New York Stock Exchange for many years. You have to understand that for the market, the short term is 1 hour, the medium term is 1 day, and the long term is 1 week. What it tells you is that what I'm talking about, which is phase 4 and 5, even the admission of phase 3, is not yet in their mind. This is why this semi-recovery from the deep down that we had a few weeks ago is a unique opportunity if you are overexposed to the equity market to sell shares, because it can only go one way, and it's down. Thank you, Marjorie.
We have to have a disclaimer that we're not giving out investment information, George. But thank you very much for that stark and insightful commentary. Federico, I'd also like to remind the people listening that if you have questions, you can post them now. You can use your chat box and put your questions up, and we'll get to as many as we can when we're finished with going through our panelists. But you can put them up as you think of them. So Federico.
Thank you, Marjorie. Well, I'm going to focus on 2 main points. The first point is, I'm sure that all people here in this virtual breakfast have made some reflections the last days, the last weeks. And my reflection has been how we got to this crisis. Look around your home, your job, probably your family, how you got to this crisis. I have several clients in the public and in the private sector, and I ask the same question: how you got to this crisis? is probably the home of your dreams, the lifestyle that you want. So this can apply also to your business, to your university, to your NGO, or to our country. So how Mexico got to this crisis. And it's like really catastrophic right now in the Mexican situation. First of all, because security. We had the worst year of security, the worst month, the worst week, and probably today is going to be the worst day in security in Mexico. Second, oil industry. I don't have to talk a lot about oil industry. We know everybody what is happening. Tourism. Tourism had the lowest hotel occupancy in history in Mexico. You know that is one of our strengths in the country. Manufacture that is more in the north part and in the middle area in Mexico. 45% of Mexican manufacture have reported a negative impact. Remittances, no, the Mexican Americans that are in the US, they are going to decrease between 17 and 21% of this cash through Mexico. And probably the agro-industry that we're going to talk more about, the agro-industry that is probably one of the our best areas right now in Mexico. So it's not a good scene right now in our country, but we can focus on the drama or we can focus on our ideas. And that's what we are doing this. I think the key word of this crisis is adaptability. And that's what we have to focus. How we adapt to this new normal, no, as we mentioned. And if we have all these bad situation, also we need to find some positive situation in Mexico. And we have some of specific points, and this is like the second part, the second point that I want to talk. We're the country with more agreements, international agreements in trade commerce. We need to understand in Mexico that the market is not Mexico. The market is the world. No? As James was saying before, we need to focus on Asian market, on Latin American market, and we need to understand that Mexico is not the only market, because Mexicans love to sell to Mexicans. No, that's the first positive situation. The relation between Canada, United States, and Mexico, it's a huge positive impact for the next years. Also, the resilience that have the Mexican attitude, the Mexican people, because we have been through a lot of crises in the last years, security crisis, economic crisis, a lot of crisis. But I think the best value that we have right now, and I don't know if you agree or the people in the audience agree, is that Mexicans were very fast. And probably is not mentioned a lot because we have a lot other values as Mexicans, but right now, I think it's the best value that we can apply for this crisis. We're very fast. And now being fast to adapt is going to be very interesting for the future. Let me give you an example. Tecnológico de Monterrey, that is one of the best universities in Mexico, in just 1 week, they adapt a hospital. They train 10,000 professors, and they adapt 55,000 courses online in 1 week. So adaptability for us, it has to be the key response for all the industries. I work with several companies like Mundo Imperial, that is one of the best touristic groups in Mexico, Xcaret, that also is one of the best touristic groups, and they adapt in 1 week, not what they had to do for the next steps, no? As George was saying. And for me, I want just to finish that we truly need to evolve right now from this traditional manufacture and understand and start applying these exponential technologies. For example, in the north of Mexico, we have to evolve from manufacture to manufacture, and we can do it. And they are applying. Chihuahua is now focused on robotics, on artificial intelligence, nanotechnology. Bajío, that is the down part of the north of Mexico, that is focused on automotive. They have to migrate from automotive to automatization. No, that's a clue. In the heartland of Mexico, Puebla, Mexico City, no, state of Mexico, they had to go from banking fintech, to big data, and also the west of Mexico, Jalisco, Michoacan, that you know very well, they had to go from the agro-industry, traditional agro-industry, to biotechnology and nanotechnology. And for me, the evolution and the adaptability that we can have as decision makers in Mexico, as strategists, as top leaders in the political area, in the economic area, and the social area, we need to start to understand that, for example, in tourism, the new passport is going to be your health. We need to understand some countries are now doing this test, in the airports. So in touristic, the health is going to be the new passport. In the medical industry, we need to focus on investigation. Universities, they need to apply new programs. In Mexico, we have a lot of lawyers, a lot of accountability, psychologists. The public universities are full of these main courses, and we need to start thinking about developing softwares, robotics. We're doing, but we need to increase that. And real estate, of course, that is going to be a really interesting situation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, Mr. Ambassador, what can you tell us?
Well, thank you very much, Marjorie. Well, from a U.S. perspective, as Federico indicated in part, also from here, Mexico was already in an economic slowdown. The IMF was predicting a 1% growth for this year before the pandemic. They pointed to a number of shortcomings in performance. Construction and manufacturing had declined, job creation had performed very poorly, there was poor business and consumer confidence. And so what's happened, of course, with the onset of this crisis is that all those tendencies have been exacerbated. So the IMF is talking about 6.6% contraction for this year. Citibanamex just came out with 9% contraction. Some private analysts are talking about a larger contraction. So clearly a big challenge ahead. And some of the things that in the future can be a positive are also magnifying the short-term impact. One is its close connection with the United States and the dependence on supply chains, not just to the US, but other places too, other suppliers that are being disrupted by this. The oil price drop will have a big effect, not in the short term, because Mexico very wisely hedged its price for this year. So it will actually get about $6 billion because of that hedging. But over the longer term, tourism and remittances being its a major, perhaps the largest source of income, are going to be down this year. The crime and violence continuing at extremely high rates. So it's going to be a very difficult period. And you're seeing this in the overall ratings for Mexico, which have dropped, not just the Pemex ratings, but the overall ratings for Mexico. In the short term, there are a lot of jobs that have been lost. Businesses calling out for more help to support employment, support them keeping people employed. In the last day, we've had a major package of support announced by the central bank, $30 billion worth of support for the financial sector. And AMLO, the president of Mexico, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, yesterday announced an austerity program as a way of addressing this, not an economic stimulus, but slashing further government expenditures in a number of steps. So, you know, we're going to see what impact that has. And at the same time, the government of Mexico has announced that they've entered the worst phase of dealing with this crisis. Phase 3, as they're calling it, they expect it to have the greatest impact throughout May, and then they're hoping that they will come out of it during June. There are a number of questions about how well people were prepared for this ahead of time, including with social distancing at a number of different levels in the government and in society. There's still questions about how well an already overburdened health system will be able to deal with this. They've received some support in getting respirators and other things from the United States and China. But it's still going to be a tremendously heavy burden on Mexico's health system. So we're just going to have to see, you know, what this looks like over the months ahead. Clearly, there are a number of opportunities, as Federico mentioned, coming out of this. I think the prospect of putting USMCA into effect in the months ahead can help in the trade sector provide a needed boost and to re-energizing economic activity. The three governments need to coordinate very closely on that to make sure that's ready to go. And related to that is the whole reimagining of supply chains. I do think Mexico can gain a lot as global supply chains are reimagined, but also supply chains in North America. And they can, I think, attract additional investment going forward. But it's not going to happen automatically. It's going to take concerted private sector and government cooperation. It's going to take talking through with partners as well, how to make all of these things work more smartly. And it's going to take investment by the private sector and by the public sector in those factors that Federico mentioned, where Mexico has strength in its youth going through universities, in innovation. And these have not been areas that have been have received investment in the last several years, the kind of investment they need at the upper levels in order to get a more medium and higher term set of industries going. It's a big challenge for Mexico. They have to, of course, deal with those in the lower parts of the income spectrum and help them, but they also have to keep investing in those different sectors that is going to feed their economy. So let me just stop there and hand it back over.
Okay, so I'm going to let the audience know what we're going to do next, because Javier is going to perhaps take us in a more positive direction by being a solutions provider here, of talking about how technology can help to move us ahead and perhaps get us back to work faster. And he has a hard stop at 10, but there are some very good questions that people had. So we can continue a little bit past the hour if people want their questions answered. And so if you have more questions, go ahead and put them out, and we'll get to as many of them as we can within a confined period of time past the hour if we need to go. But Javier, I want to give you a chance to address, maybe leave us in a more positive framework of how we can look ahead.
Perfect. Thanks, Marjorie. I will try. So, so there's technology available today that can help both governments and private companies to manage the current situation, and also to manage the, let's call it, go back to semi-normal. Okay. So let me start with governments, because obviously probably that's more relevant and is a bit more challenging because they need to reach out to millions of people. So obviously the best technology to reach out to millions of people in any country in the world is through their cell phones. Okay, so basically try to reach them through their cell phones without invading their privacy. So there are technologies that can be today deployed in the mobile carriers network that allow to do that. So two different types of technologies. I will just describe it very, very briefly. One is called cell broadcast, which basically allows to use the mobile carrier network to send a message to millions of people in questions of seconds. And that's in fact something that, as we speak, we are implementing in Peru. So Peru is rolling out the system like that. And then there's another type of technology, which is also used in the carrier network, which is called location-based SMS. Okay. With this technology, you can select, for example, a specific area of a country. You can select even a hospital, and basically you can send a message to the people who happen to be in that area using the mobile carrier network. Okay, so those two technologies are used. This, for example, is the technology that is used in most of the Nordic countries. So in Iceland, in Sweden, in Norway. So what you can do in the go back to normal, I would like to share with all of you, for example, the example of Norway. So you've seen when Mario was sharing with you the details of the different countries. I think if we look at Norway, once this crisis has passed, probably Norway will be, with South Korea, one of the countries who manage this in the best possible way. So as I mentioned before, they're using this location-based technology, and the first thing they can do is they can, because obviously they can detect based on the, as I said, on the cell phone and based on the SIM cards, the nationality of the different people. So the first thing they are doing is they are reaching out to all the Norwegians that are in different countries in the world that have, for whatever reason, they have been locked down in a different country, and start communicating with them in case they want to return back to Norway, because airports and everything are starting to go back to semi-normal next week. And at the same time, they are reaching out to the different nationalities within Norway, foreign people in Norway that they need to go back to their countries. So that's one of the things they are doing in the go back to normal. Second thing they do is, as Marjorie described at the beginning, we can provide risk intelligence information of basically when there is a new hotspot in the country, a new outbreak. So what they can do is, if there's a new hotspot in a specific area of the country, they can immediately notify all the people in that area that there's a new outbreak in that area. So they should take a test or they should stay home. And they can also notify all the people in the area around that area, basically telling them don't go there. So basically there's an outbreak in this specific place, so please avoid going there. So that's the second thing they're using for it. And then the third thing they use it for is they call it like situational awareness. So they have identified in the country some hotspots like shopping centers or malls where people, when they go back to the normal again, they will tend to go and basically what they can track is the amount of people there based on the number of cell phones. And then when the number of people goes over a specific threshold, they can send a message to all the people in the area saying, okay, if you don't have to be there for a critical thing, please go back home because there's too many people in that area. And then the risk of you getting infected is higher. Okay. So that's, as I said, examples of what countries are already doing in the go back to normal using technology. And as I mentioned at the beginning, if we compare the outcome in these countries, for example, Norway, with some of the other countries in Europe that basically are using zero to none technology, I mean, they have in total 180 people dead, compared with the tens of thousands of people that unfortunately the UK, Spain, Italy, or France have. So as you can see, it's 100 times less than these countries. Even if we compare comparing among the population, it's more than tenfold lower in terms of ratio of dead people. They are opening schools on Monday, and basically in all the other countries in Europe, we are still in the middle of, we're still discussing how we are going to start going back to this semi-normal. Okay, so that's on the government side. If we look at the enterprises, most companies are global today, multinational, doing business in many countries, as we discussed before. So for companies, is usually easier because two things. Usually companies have a database with all the data of all their employees that they can upload in a software system, a software platform. And the second thing is they can enforce the use of a mobile app to their employees. So basically having in mind these two factors, for companies it's relatively easier to manage go back to normal using technology. So again, we provide all this risk information for companies. So once you know where all your people and all your assets, building, manufacturing facilities, everything, where in the world they are, you can get basically updated information on where the new outbreaks are happening, and you can decide to shut down an office in a specific country, to shut down a manufacturing facility in another country. If there's something affecting one of those supply chains in a country, you can look for alternatives. So you can do all these kind of things. And the second thing you could do is also for your employees. So the first thing you can do is to monitor the employees that you have that are not feeling well, and basically ask them to stay at home and isolated. You can also control how many employees are going back and start to control and to ready get ready for slowly going back to work. So you can say, okay, so basically this function, or 2-3 people from this function and that function can go to that office. So you can do all these kind of things because you can reach every single one of your employees using a mobile app, which is very simple. So again, I think there is technology that, if it's properly used and deployed, can help both countries and companies to have a, I wouldn't say an easy, but at least can ease significantly the go back to normal process. Okay.
Thank you very much. We do have a lot of questions to get to. We also have somebody in the audience who's an expert on Colombia, if we want to get some other perspective on this. So maybe we can do some interchange. But Xavier, I'm very aware that you have to leave us. So there was a question for you, and I'm going to start with that question and then go to the rest. And it's a question that you probably will like. So because the question was, where can people get the technology that you're talking about? What companies provide that kind of technology? So and we can give out more information after. So anyway.
Yeah, so no, I was going to say, so obviously we in Everbridge, we are the ones who are supplying that technology to the Norwegian government, as I mentioned before, Sweden, Iceland, and those companies. So that technology is already available. We have a lot of enterprise companies using our technology as well.
If there are no other questions, so you're welcome to stay on as long as you do. Jim, there were a couple questions relating to China that maybe we can bundle together. There's questions for everybody, so we'll get to those in a minute. So you mentioned that manufacturing is a possibility for Latin America. Do you have particular sectors that you think will be in demand? And I think there was one which why don't you start with that one and I'll see if there's something too.
Well, you know, a lot of the shoes and textiles and toys have already moved out to Sri Lanka and Indonesia and Philippines and Southeast Asia, but I still think there's some of that to go. Whether that meets the price point, it depends on the country in Latin America and what their wage rates are. Consumer electronics, everything from rice cookers to laptops. You know, companies like Dell have had almost all their manufacturing in China, and they have to diversify and get part of it out. Refrigerators, you name it. I think a lot of it is consumer products, consumer electronics, appliances, you know, consumer goods for the household and for companies. You know, even if it's printers, all of that kind of stuff.
And then there was a question also on the new normal, the impulse to nationalism. And I think probably Ambassador Wayne and I think and Jim both on this one. Are countries, mainly G20 countries, going to take back manufacturing and agriculture industries to some extent? And that there was a comment about China's already looking to expand in Mexico in a few industrial parks and bring supply chains closer to their US operations.
So if you want, I'll start with nationalism. It's very bad in China today. They're you know, China always blames any problem they have on foreigners, and it's really ignited by this, and I'm also ignited by Secretary Pompeo and the nationalism against China in the U.S. I've never felt it like that. I've had friends who are sitting in a McDonald's in China, foreigners who have a Chinese person come up and yell at them and call them foreign trash, get out of my country. Same thing is happening to Chinese here. It's really bad. I don't want to paint it as terrible, but it's just a trend that is so disheartening, Marjorie.
Well, I think the question is even a little bit broader, whether the nationalism in general, not just in China, is going to get countries to look at their own industries and try to bring them closer to home. So I don't know, Ambassador Wayne, whether you have a point of view. And then George, there's several finance questions we'll get to next. You're muted, Ambassador Wayne. There you go.
Yes. Okay. Yes. I think there's going to be a re-examination of supply chains. I think that the key thing is that this be a reasonable debate, and that all the stakeholders in our connectivity with other countries, which goes way beyond manufacturing. It goes to the agricultural sector, it goes to the service sector, it goes to all the people that are supported by that. Understand that there are reasonable steps to take to diversify your supply chains, to make them more efficient. There are some things where we were already moving in the United States to bring some functions back to the United States because of technological change. And all those need to be pursued, but they need to be pursued in a way that is a rational debate of the pros and cons. And that's going to be the big challenge, it seems, that everybody who has a perspective and an understanding of the broader importance of connectivity in commerce and creativity needs to participate in this debate. And it doesn't mean it's going to be easy. I think it will be challenging a number of times because there will be those trends that were mentioned for that are real toward nationalism and reaction about anything coming from outside of a country and blame to that. So I think we should prepare for a very serious debate, and it's going to take a lot of participation from a lot of people to keep this at a reasonable re-examination, which there is. And there are some good things that could be done in the whole supply chain without destroying the real positives that are there for future growth. And I think we have to remember that if we want to get an economy back and running full speed, it is going to take international commerce to be a key part of that for many countries around the world, and even the United States, which has a very large domestic economy of its own. But just in North America, there are 12 million US jobs supported by trade only with its two neighbors. And then the transatlantic relationship is not quite as big in trade, but if you look at affiliate foreign direct investment and ownership, it is much larger. So those connections need to be recalled to people as part of this debate.
Along the same lines, just as a follow-on to that, there was a question also about elections and whether these elections following all of this are going to deliver more governments that have favorable opinion of globalization versus populism. I don't know how you all feel about that, but I know there's been a lot of talk about governments and people maybe focusing more, being more anti-globalization from this, but I don't know what your point of view is. Ambassador, why don't you start?
Okay, yes, I certainly think that's going to be one of the important themes. And there will be those who will play to the populist and nativist elements. There's no question about that. And that's, again, why we need also both politicians and all the stakeholders, the millions of stakeholders who see the value of this international connectivity to be actively participating in the political debates as they go forward. There's no question that this is going to be an important trend. And we're, I don't know how the elections are going to come out, but I have hope from the fact that there are a number of political leaders and prospective political leaders who do see the importance of handling this in a wise manner that really can magnify growth while taking the needed security steps.
George, so there were a number of finance questions, but let's start with these two and then we'll get into some more questions. So what countries do you think have the highest risk of default, to fail in a default? And then the second question was, do you think countries that have a slow recovery, do you see more universal basic income as being a solution?
Let me take the second question first, because the answer is the easiest. As desirable as a universal minimum income could be, the current situation will have to be in terms of helicopter money like we have done, because we don't have the money to make it universal. We have arrived at a level of indebtedness where we just cannot afford it. So the second element is, of course, that when you get into a system of universal income, what is the incentive to work? And in some countries of Europe at the moment, you get more money by not working than by working and getting your unemployment benefits. In France, the people who are being laid off or whatever get 84% of their salaries. I mean, you realize that at that stage, the 16% might or might not be enough for people to work. On the first question, you have to distinguish emerging markets and non-emerging markets. And on the emerging markets, there is one one information I got at the IMF that is extremely important. 100 countries have applied to the emergency facility of the International Monetary Fund. 100 out of 159. 2/3 of the world is already in difficulty and is already trying to get money. In that universe, your guess is as good as mine, because it can come from smaller countries or bigger countries. And I would distinguish here again two categories that the IMF uses. It's the low-income countries. There will be some defaults. We already have about 10 countries in default. We will probably be, by the end of this month, about 20 countries, but they are going to be small. I mean, Belize is in default. That is not going to change the face of Earth. The problem is whether countries like the Eastern European countries, Latin America, and of course, China and India will hold on. On the so-called industrialized world, my biggest concern at the moment is Italy, because they refuse to take fiscal measures as a return for the help that they will get. And there is currently a summit in Brussels, virtual of course, to try to decide how they will allocate the $500 billion that Europe is going to do. And we have one piece of good news, is that the Germans have said they are going to do more than their share. But this is a development fund, $500 billion. It's very important that it happens. But who is going to get it and how is it going to be funded is still unclear. But the governments will give their guarantees. So on that particular front, I believe that Italy is the most worrying.
And just following on that, on foreign direct investment, there was another question about whether you think it's going to continue apace, or is it going to stop or just be delayed? What do you think is going to happen?
I would make a difference between what I call maintenance foreign direct investment. In other words, people who are already in foreign countries that need to increase their share, and there will be opportunities. We have to remember that for people, there will be opportunities to gain market share if you have been sufficiently conservative financially and if you can afford it. So that will continue. Now, at this stage, from the conversation I have with clients, I haven't heard anybody telling me that they are going to do a foreign direct investment in a new country. That is just not part of the conversation. The conversation is, how can I get out of this or the other country? Because there are no buyers. Because the M&A market is basically at a level where it is practically at a standstill. But we are going to see the wave of restructuring and M&A once people realize that some things are not going to go back to what the media call going back to where we were before. There is no go back to where we were before. We will go back to something which will be a very different place.
So Federico, there were several questions directed, especially at tourism. And what are three strategies maybe that could happen in Mexico that would help in Mexico? I'll give you a couple of these and maybe you can answer them together. And the second one was, do you think in that context that the return of American tourists to Mexico will be slower and people will stay north of the border and prefer to go to US spots? And then finally, along the same lines, there was just a comment about agreeing with you that the challenge, about the challenges Mexico has, and about the private sector now joining together in a way that the private sector has to be more active and more advocating for itself in this situation, so that there can be a different kind of partnerships that are evolving with the government and with others. And we can get into the partnership question because it was a little bit broader than that. Maybe I'll leave that one aside and let you do the first two. And then for the audience, we're going to go for about 5 more minutes with questions, and then we'll wrap this up, just so you have your own planning abilities.
Thank you, Marjorie. Well, probably the first strategy, that we have to do in Mexico is the digitalization of the touristic area. Right now, everybody is buying everything through your cell phone, through your computer. 10 years ago, probably the only thing that you can buy in touristic probably was the hotel and probably the airplane. Now you can buy everything, all your experiences, through online services. So there are a lot of medium and small companies in Mexico that they haven't been digitalized. So this is the perfect moment that local governments can help small companies in the touristic area to be digitalized, and people is going to start thinking during this period where they want to go after this crisis. So I think the first is digitalization. Second, of course, it has to be with sanitation. No, is the new black in the tourism. No, how the resorts and the hotels and restaurants and everything, they are going to communicate all the sanitation measures and protocols they are doing. And a good news, the tourism sector industry probably is going to be the most heated right now, but it probably is going to be the one that have one of the most rapid recoveries in Mexico. Why? Probably because 70% of American people say that they will travel after the crisis, but also they say that they are going to lower the budget, to reduce their budgets 40%. So Mexico now, it's a good option after the crisis for people that, for Americans and Canadians that they were thinking going to Asia or probably Europe or other parts of the world, because it's going to be more cheaper to go to other places, and also because it's more close to the United States. So I think the recovery in the industry, into the touristic industry, is going to be more focused on wellness, sustainability, nature experience, and of course, sun and beach, that Mexico is in the top of the line. And in the second area of the industry, entertainment is going to be very hard. Cruises and also the MICE industry, meetings and entertainment, and the sports travel industry also is going to be, I think, probably to the next year. But digitalize the industry in your local governments, sanitation, and open spaces, warm places, beach places, natural, wellness, sustainability, that are the trends of tourism.
Thank you. So we're going to wrap up. I want to remind everybody, first of all, there's some questions we didn't get to, and I think we can save these and maybe we can answer them offline. The second thing I was going to mention is that I want to remind you, you can get a recording, and somebody asked the question about where they can find more data on some of the surveys that we had on earlier. And you can get all of that at apcoworldwide.com/coronavirus, or you can just click on it when you get on the website. You'll see there's a whole section for all the updates on coronavirus, and you're welcome to go there. You can also send us your questions. And then I want to there were several questions that had to do with, what can I do? You know, how are governments hearing from businesses that have shut down? How can I, as a citizen, let people know what's important to me? You know, how do I participate in all of this? And maybe as a last thought, each of you could say something about people listening in, from whether they're running a business or whether they're in education. There were questions about virtual education. What can individuals do to take more control of their life during a time like this? So should we go in reverse order here? Tony, you want to start?
Well, of course, that's a big challenge for all of us, no matter where we're living right now. How can we do that? I mean, one of the key things is letting your government representatives know what you really think, and not just complaining in a sense, but offer them ideas as to what should be done. For example, in North America, the three governments need to be talking and working with the private sector about what's going to happen with these supply chains. How do you get the economy going? We saw there was a back and forth between the United States and Mexico as to why in the US and Canada, the aerospace industry was essential, but it wasn't in Mexico. and that was undermining supply chains. So start talking about these things, getting ready. I think similarly, what Federico said is exactly right. We're going to see businesses reinvent themselves, and sectors are going to be reinventing. And so what that means is that people are going to be exploring more use of technology, and rightly so, more digitalization, but there are going to be new demands on workers. So we can't neglect right now the kind of education and upskilling that's going to be needed for our workers as this new economy emerges. And you can't be cutting investment in those areas when you're going to have to support your existing workers and students coming in. So you're going to have to be inventing new ways of doing this. And so underlining these themes that are important to your representatives, but then working with colleagues in that same area to come up with inventive frameworks and ideas for moving ahead in this new economy can be very helpful, because it's not that governments have all the good ideas. They don't. They're often looking for good ideas. So that's something that all of us can collaborate with each other virtually and put those ideas out there, put those suggestions out there. So that's over to you all.
George?
I'm going to bring an issue that is in my mind and has been very increased this weekend. I was born 75 years ago at the end of World War II, and I spent my youth understanding how we got there. And I see in this country, the United States, in Brazil, and in other countries, a resurgence of fascism, a resurgence of militia going against states, and actions where the authoritarianism is growing in many countries in the world. And I think the most important thing is that we should not be simplistic. As much as Jim says the Chinese are blaming the foreigners, I am absolutely convinced that the next campaign in the United States will be against China, which is dangerous. And therefore, what I would like to say is that each of us in our conversation, but also in our own self-education, let's make sure we see the reality with its complexity and don't fall into the trap of protectionism and nationalism. That's my main concern.
Jim?
Yeah, I'll just go micro. I work with a lot of young people who have never seen anything like this. None of us have ever seen anything of this magnitude, but we've all been through some ups and downs over the years. Got to remember the young people around us who work with us, they've never seen anything like this and they're scared, and do your best to keep them informed and help them get through it.
Thank you. Federico?
Well, I truly believe that this time it's a time for true leaders. We're going to see big companies falling down, big leaders falling down, and I think it's also a time where emerging leaders can arrive with new ideas, with new proposals. New companies are going to set up new communities, like the Mexican American community is going to be very strong right now for both countries. So I think the leadership right now is going to change from 180, 100%. So I think that we need to focus on good ideas, stop focus on the national drama right now, and focus on our ideas and to build and create and innovate.
Thank you. So just before we go, as I said before, we have an expert on the line from Colombia, and we've been talking a lot about. Maybe unmute you if you want to maybe give a last comment from Vali from the point of view of somebody looking at this a little differently. We'd like to just give you 1 minute before we wrap up.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Hi, how are you? I'm Jonathan Avila from Valley Consultants. Just wrapping up, I'm just seeing that poverty in Latin will be a challenge There's a lot of information of the World Bank in relation with this. And I think that the tension that we have right now between poverty and people just trying to go to work at the local level will be a challenge in order to manage the pandemic. The national government is doing a really good job, exceptional in what is happening right now. But in any case, we don't have any kind of cure, just a way to manage the process. So the number of beds and UCI and every possibility of policy that trying to control this pandemic will be very important. I'm just pointing out that something that is happening in Colombia probably is happening in other countries, and it's the tension between the national government and the local institutions. Just because people are in this tension of going out to work and find a way to eat. Digitalization will be a challenge also. This is related with the fact that some governments and the local level doesn't have any kind of tools to manage the situation due to this fact, and investments in this will be important. And we don't have, we have some plans related with this, but what are you saying about investment? It's gonna be completely problematic. Other thing is the centralization of power. It's very interesting to see how executive power is becoming the central point for any of these discussions. But the legislative power is not part of the actors or the stakeholders taking any decisions. And in Colombia, it's becoming a problem in order to manage how to control the decisions that are taken on the central government. Respecting our infrastructure, I just want to say that this is probably the most central part in order to recover the economy in a post-COVID situation. Even though the price of oil today are not precisely a positive message, it is clear that investments on this sector and energy will be central in order to recover the economy on the next year, probably. And definitely, I think that in similar to other countries, we are gonna need fiscal reform. And this is gonna be a huge problem precisely between how to recover from poverty and the need from the central government to centralize resources in order to solve the problem. We don't have $1 trillion to solve the problem in Colombia as in the United States, even though this will be an amount to increase debt. And this will be a problem for, I think, not just Colombia, but countries as Ecuador, for example. I think that Peru is in a very healthy situation, but it will be a challenge. And about how to deal with nationalism, it's very problematic because the solution of the problem in Colombia will be regional. We need to have a dialogue with Venezuela, Peru, and Ecuador. And you know the tension that we already have with Venezuela. So I think that one question that is very important, and I want to put it in this scenario, is how to deal with diplomacy at the local level, because we need to have a conversation with the IMF and the World Bank and other centers of investment and have the Inter-American Bank. So just to take this minute, these are ideas related with Colombia that I just want to put and share with you.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Could go on for a long time. As we said at the beginning, this is one of a series. This is one of a series, and we will be taking it from here and future. And I thank you for your very good questions. I think as we close, one thing I would just like to leave people with is the idea that out of crisis comes opportunity, and I may be the eternal optimist on the phone, on the conference, but I think that we can't let this be a time that divides us. We have to hopefully come out of this with greater empathy for our fellow men and to look for maybe a new kind of way of working together. And hopefully that will be part of our future as well. So thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you for being with us. And thank you for all sticking with us through this extenuated session. We